Today, we're diving into a pretty heavy topic: sexual harassment, and how it's deeply tied to larger societal issues, not just the actions of individuals. It's all about shifting the way we view and understand human interactions, right?
Absolutely. I think a lot of people see sexual harassment as a black and white issue. But when you start looking at it from a broader perspective, it's tied to much more than just individual behavior. It's really about the overall structure and the paradigms we live by.
And that's the tricky part, isn't it? There's this idea that if we just focus on solving sexual harassment on its own, we'll fix the problem. But really, everything's interconnected. The way we view gender, power, authority, it all plays into this.
Exactly. Take the workplace, for example. You mentioned power dynamics earlier. People in higher positions have the ability to exploit that power, and that often leads to harassment. But it's not just a power issue. It's also about societal norms, expectations, and how we've been conditioned to see certain behaviors as acceptable.
Right? And it's kind of disturbing to think about, but it's not always the higher ups that are to blame. There's also a whole dynamic in how people perceive sexual harassment. Like, when someone gets harassed, people often ask, what were they wearing? Or did they provoke it in some way?
And that kind of thinking can be dangerous. It's not about what someone wears, it's about consent. Consent is the key. If someone touches you without your consent, that's harassment. And this applies regardless of what someone is wearing or how they look.
So, are you saying that it's not about the outward appearance, but about the intent and mutual respect in the interaction?
Exactly. A lot of people don't realize that even something like a glance isn't necessarily harassment. It's only harassment if it makes the other person uncomfortable or if it crosses a boundary. But once you move into physical contact, that's a different story. Consent is the line that shouldn't be crossed.
That makes sense. So it's all about context, right? The situation has to be looked at in its entirety before jumping to conclusions about whether or not it's harassment.
Yes, and that's where it gets complicated. People sometimes try to simplify things and say, well, she wore a mini skirt, so it's her fault. But that kind of thinking ignores the much bigger picture. Everyone has the right to feel safe, regardless of how they dress or act.
So, let's dig into the numbers a bit. You've mentioned this 3.7 ratio, where the person who gets harassed is seen as 70% at fault. Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure, it's a controversial idea. It suggests that the person who's harassed plays a role in the situation. Sometimes it's the way they act or their environment that might lead to it, even if they didn't intend for it to happen. But of course, that doesn't excuse the offender's behavior. They are still 30% at fault.
But it doesn't stop there. What happens when the offender gets caught?
This is where it gets even more interesting. When the offender is caught, the blame shifts. Now, the offender is 70% at fault because they failed to handle the aftermath. They didn't take responsibility for their actions, which is crucial in preventing the cycle from repeating.
So the real issue is that the offender didn't learn from the experience, right? They blame their bad luck instead of reflecting on their actions.
Exactly. They don't see the experience as a lesson to change their behavior. And this cycle keeps repeating. Victims keep reporting, offenders keep getting caught, but nothing really changes.
So how do we break this cycle? How do we move beyond this repeated pattern?
Well, it comes down to a major shift in perspective. People need to stop blaming others for what's happening and start reflecting on their own role in the situation. If both sides, offenders and victims, take responsibility, we could start to see real change. It's about awareness and education.
It sounds like it's all about the individual's growth, the willingness to learn from mistakes and understand the impact of their actions.
Yes, absolutely. If we can change the way we live and the way we approach these issues, everything else will follow. But it's not an easy task. It requires a complete paradigm shift in how we think about relationships, power, and respect.
It really does. So, what's the takeaway here? How do we take that first step toward this bigger shift?
I think it starts with changing how we view these issues, not as isolated incidents, but as part of a larger pattern. Once we acknowledge that, we can start addressing the root causes and create environments where respect, consent, and responsibility are prioritized.
It's going to be a long road, but the conversation is the first step, right?
Definitely. And just like any major change, it takes time. But as long as we keep having these conversations, we're moving in the right direction.
Well, that's a wrap for today. Thanks for the deep dive into such an important topic.
Anytime. Let's keep challenging these ideas and continue to learn from each other.